9 men floated face down in the Starlight Motel pool under a halo of buzzing neon, their bodies bobbing against the tile edges like forgotten pool toys. The chlorine couldn't mask the smell of vomit and beer that hung in the humid August air. This is the story of how 2 teenage girls turned a roadside swimming pool into an execution chamber, and why an entire community looked the other way. Before we dive into this dark chapter of Texas history, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if true crime stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in police files for over 50 years. San Antonio in 1972 sat at the crossroads of America's underbelly. Interstate 10 cut through the city like a scar, bringing truckers, drifters, and runaways to cheap motels where cash meant no questions and the air conditioning worked half the time. The Starlight Motor Court squatted on the eastern edge of town, where the highway noise never stopped and the pool water stayed lukewarm year-round. Maria and Carmen Vega checked into room 114 on July 30th under the names Lopez. The sisters were 19 and 17, with their cousin Rosa's high school photograph folded in Maria's purse. The clerk, a man named Vernon who smelled like Old Spice and regret, barely glanced at their fake IDs. He was more interested in the cash Maria laid on the counter 2 weeks in advance. "Pool's open till midnight," Vernon had said, his eyes lingering too long on Carmen. "Gets real popular with the regulars around 10. The sisters had smiled. That's exactly what they'd come to find out. Rosa Elena Vega had been 16 when she'd left Corpus Christi that spring, chasing promises of a waitressing job in Albuquerque. Her postcards arrived weekly at first, bright images of Route 66 landmarks with messages written in her looping hand. "Made it to Austin. Everyone here is so friendly." Then San Antonio. Then nothing. The last postcard, dated June 18th, showed the Alamo at sunset. On the back, Rosa had written only, "Staying at a place with a pool. Might be here a while. Love you all." When 3 weeks passed with no word, Maria had called the number Rosa had scribbled at the bottom. A man answered drunk, slurring, music blaring behind him. When Maria asked for Rosa, he'd laughed. "Little Mexican girl with braids?" "Yeah, she was here. Real popular with the fellas. Haven't seen her in a week, though. Girls like that, they move on." The police in San Antonio had been less than helpful. Detective Frank Morrison took Maria's report with visible boredom, his pen barely moving across the page. 16-year-old runaway stops calling home? Happens every day, sweetheart. She probably met some boy, headed to California. These girls always turn up eventually. But Rosa's sisters knew better. Rosa had been saving money for secretarial school. She'd been writing in a diary since she was 12. She didn't just disappear without a word. Maria had hung up the payphone outside Morrison's office and made a decision. If the police wouldn't look for Rosa, she would. The Vega family was small, but fiercely loyal. Maria and Carmen's older brothers, Luis and Tomas, agreed to help without hesitation. Their father had died in the oil fields when they were young. Their mother cleaned houses to keep them fed. Family was everything. And Rosa, sweet, trusting Rosa, who believed everyone had good in them, was family. They started with the phone number. A reverse directory led them to the Starlight Motor Court. A drive-by showed exactly what kind of place it was. Peeling paint, cars with out-of-state plates, women in too tight dresses smoking by the vending machines. The kind of place where people went to be forgotten. Maria called the motel office, pretending to be a friend looking for Rosa. Vernon, the night clerk, had been surprisingly talkative after a few leading questions. "Oh yeah, the girl with the braids." "Sweet thing. Stayed here about 3 weeks back. Real popular with the regulars. You know how it is. They like 'em young and fresh off the bus." When Maria asked what happened to her, Vernon's tone had shifted. "Look, lady, I just work the desk. Girls come and go. Maybe she owed money to the wrong people. Maybe she just split. This ain't the kind of place where we keep track." But he'd let one detail slip. "Last time I saw her, she was getting into a truck with Big Eddie. He's here most Friday nights. Uses the pool. The sisters spent the next 2 weeks studying the starlight like it was a final exam. They learned that 9 men were regulars truckers mostly, a few locals who paid for rooms by the hour. They learned which ones liked to swim at night after the families with kids had cleared out. They learned which ones Vernon warned the working girls about with a knowing look. They learned which ones had probably seen Rosa last. Every pattern has a breaking point. The Starlight's pool deck smelled like sun-baked concrete and spilled beer, the surface gritty with cigarette ash that never fully washed away between cleanings. At night, the underwater lights hummed with electrical current that made the water glow an artificial turquoise. The Vega sisters weren't the only ones watching, but they were the only ones taking notes. Maria had purchased a small spiral notebook from the drugstore across the highway. Every evening, she and Carmen would sit in the plastic chairs outside their room, pretending to read magazines while documenting arrivals, times, license plates, physical descriptions, who talked to whom, who swam alone. The 9 regulars emerged from the chaos like a pattern in static. Big Eddie arrived every Friday around 9 p.m. in a Peterbilt with Oklahoma plates, his gut hanging over a belt buckle the size of a saucer. He'd park in the back lot, rent room 203 by the hour, then hit the pool with a 6-pack. Vernon had mentioned him by name. The sisters made him target number 1. Danny Slim Morrison, no relation to the useless detective, drove a refrigerated truck for a meat company. 28 years old, wedding ring on a chain around his neck instead of his finger. He liked to swim laps at 10:30 when the families cleared out and the working girls started their shifts. Carmen had watched him corner a young black girl by the deep end, his hand on the small of her back, his smile too wide. There was Ray Thornton, a local who managed a tire shop and paid cash for room 109 every Tuesday and Thursday. His wife thought he worked late inventory. The motel staff knew better. The Vega sisters learned to read the ecosystem. Which men traveled in pairs, safety in numbers, trading stories about the girls they'd met. Which ones hunted alone, which ones Vernon greeted with the familiarity of regular business. From Maria's notebook, dated August 5, 1972. Counted 6 tonight between 9 to 11 p.m. Big Eddie, Slim, Ray, plus 3 others, bald guy with Ford pickup Texas plates, JKL 447, younger Mexican guy with the scar, white-haired man Vernon called Coach. They all knew each other, shared cigarettes, talked about the new crop coming through. Made me sick. Luis and Tomas drove in from Corpus Christi on August 7th with a pickup truck full of equipment their sister had requested. Pool cleaning supplies, a case of Lone Star beer, industrial-strength sedatives Luis had borrowed from the veterinary clinic where he worked nights, and something else, wrapped in canvas that neither sister asked about. "You sure about this?" Luis had asked, sitting in their motel room with the curtains drawn. At 23, he was the eldest, the one who'd stepped into their father's role. "Once we start, there's no going back." Maria had spread Rosa's postcards across the cigarette-burned dresser. They know what happened to her. Maybe all of them. Maybe just one. But they know, and they're not going to tell us. Carmen, quieter but no less determined, added what they'd learned that afternoon. A waitress at the truck stop had recognized Rosa's photo. "Oh, honey, she was here. Sweet girl. Got mixed up with the wrong crowd real fast." One of the regulars, Big Eddie, I think said he could get her work at a bar in Houston. That was June? Haven't seen her since. The same story, different details. Rosa had been there. Rosa had trusted the wrong man. Rosa had vanished. The police file on Rosa Elena Vega, obtained through a friend who worked in the records department, contained exactly 3 pages. Missing person report. 1 follow-up call logged. No new information. Case status. Inactive. Presumed voluntary disappearance. 16 years old, and they'd written her off before the ink dried. The plan came together over cheap tacos and cheaper beer in room 114, with Carmen's transistor radio playing low to cover their voices. They would need everyone at the pool at once. They would need the men relaxed, unsuspecting. They would need Vernon either compliant or absent. A party, Carmen had suggested. Free beer. We tell the regulars we're celebrating doesn't matter what. Men like free alcohol, and girls who smile. Tomas, who'd been quiet through most of the planning, finally spoke. The pool has a gate, locks from the outside. I checked. Maria met her brother's eyes. In that look, passed an understanding darker than anything they'd said aloud. The ladders, Luis added, his veterinary training making him clinical. 2 entry points, the shallow end steps, and the ladder at the deep end. Both removable. They weren't planning a confrontation. They weren't planning to ask questions. Justice doesn't always come through courts. The execution would require precision. The 9 men kept different schedules, different routines. Getting them all together meant orchestrating something that looked accidental, spontaneous. The sisters spent another week fine-tuning their approach, learning which men knew each other well enough to pass along an invitation, which ones would show up for free beer, and the promise of party girls. Vernon, they decided, would be the key. The night clerk controlled access to the pool area after hours, could override the automatic locks, could be convinced to look the other way for the right price or the right distraction. Carmen had volunteered for that part. She'd seen the way Vernon looked at her when they paid their rent, the way his eyes followed her to the ice machine. She knew exactly how to keep him occupied. By August 15th, they had their date, Saturday the 19th, the hottest weekend of the summer, when everyone would want to be in the water, when 9 tired men would welcome the chance to cool off and drink free beer with 2 pretty girls who seemed impressed by their road stories. Maria bought party supplies at 3 different stores so no single clerk would remember. Paper plates, plastic cups, a styrofoam cooler large enough to hold 30 beers, and enough ice to keep them cold. And Luis's contribution carefully measured, carefully mixed into 6 of those beers with a precision he'd learned from dosing livestock. Not enough to kill, just enough to make swimming difficult, to make the arms heavy and the legs stop kicking, to make the edge of the pool seem very far away when the ladder wasn't there anymore. The sisters knew they were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But somewhere between San Antonio and wherever Rosa's body was buried, that line had already been crossed for them. What would you do if the law refused to protect someone you loved? The coolers sat in the shade by the pool fence, condensation already beating on the white styrofoam, ice shifting inside with the sound of glass teeth chattering. Carmen arranged the cups in perfect rows, while Maria checked her watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Everything depended on the next 3 hours going exactly as planned. Saturday, August 19th dawned, with a kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer like water and turned the Starlight's parking lot into a griddle. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 104 degrees. By 6 p.m., it had barely dropped. The pool, usually deserted until after dark, saw families with screaming kids trying to escape the heat. But Maria and Carmen waited them out, knowing the real crowd would arrive later. Vernon had been surprisingly easy to manage. Carmen had spent the previous evening in the office, perched on the edge of his desk, laughing at his stories about the characters who passed through. She'd mentioned, casual as breathing, that she and her sister were throwing a little party by the pool tomorrow night. Nothing crazy, just some friends, some beer, maybe some music. Thing is, she'd said, twirling a strand of dark hair around her finger, we might get a little loud. I'd hate for you to have to come down and break it up. Vernon's eyes had gone exactly where she'd expected. Well, darlin', I suppose if it's not too crazy, I could let it slide. Long as you save me a beer. Carmen had smiled. I'll save you too. What Vernon didn't know was that his beers would be clean. Only 6 bottles in the cooler contained Luis's special recipe, measured doses of acepromazine, the same tranquilizer used to calm aggressive bulls before transport, not lethal on its own. But in water, with alcohol, with heat exhaustion already setting in, the human body became an anchor. The invitations had gone out through careful channels. Maria had accidentally mentioned the party to Slim Morrison at the vending machine, knowing he'd spread the word. Carmen had slipped a note under Big Eddie's door. "Pool party tonight. Free beer, come by around 9. Signed with a lipstick kiss. Luis had talked up the tire shop guys at a bar, mentioning his hot cousins were having people over at the Starlight. The trap was baited. Now they waited to see who would bite. At 8:45 p.m., the family with the screaming kids finally packed up their floaties and left. The pool area fell quiet except for the filter pump's mechanical gurgle and the distant highway traffic. Overhead, moths circled the fluorescent lights like confused pilgrims. Maria carried the coolers down while Carmen set up the small radio she'd borrowed, tuning it to a station playing Creedence Clearwater Revival. The music would cover any sounds Vernon might otherwise notice. The music would make it seem normal, festive, like a dozen other pool parties happening across San Antonio that night. At 9:03, Big Eddie's Peterbilt rumbled into the parking lot. He emerged from the cab in swim trunks and a Hawaiian shirt that had never seen Hawaii, flip-flops slapping against his heels. "Well, hell," he said, grinning at the sisters. "You girls know how to throw a party, or what?" Maria handed him a beer from the marked section of the cooler. "We try. Get in the water, it's perfect tonight." Eddie didn't need convincing. The heat had everyone desperate for relief. He cannonballed into the deep end, sending chlorinated water sloshing onto the deck, and came up laughing. "Christ, that's good." Slim Morrison arrived at 9:15 with two other regulars Maria recognized from her notebook, the bald man with the Ford pickup, and a younger guy who worked construction. Then Ray Thornton. Then Coach, the white-haired man who'd coached Little League until parents started asking questions. Then two more whose faces the sisters had memorized, but whose names they'd never learned. 8 men. 1 missing. Carmen kept the beers flowing, tracking who got which bottle with a waitress's precision. The marked bottles went to specific targets: Eddie, Slim, Ray, the construction worker, Coach, and 3 others. The clean beers went to Vernon, who'd wandered down at 9:30 as promised, and to herself and Maria for appearance. The men swam, drank, and told the same stories men like them always told. Conquests, real or imagined. Complaints about wives, girlfriends, the law. Big Eddie held court from the shallow end, talking about a sweet thing he'd met in June who'd been real grateful for the ride to Houston. Maria's hand tightened on her beer bottle. Carmen caught her eye, shook her head slightly. Not yet. At 9:55, headlights swept across the pool area. A 9th man climbed out of a Dodge Charger Mexican, mid-30s, the scar across his left cheek, visible even from a distance. "Raul," Eddie called out. "Get your ass in here." Now they were complete. Luis and Tomas had been waiting in room 114, watching through the blinds. Maria caught Luis's silhouette against the curtain and nodded once. Her brothers moved toward the pool gate's exterior access point, tools in hand, while inside the fence, 9 men floated and laughed and drank their poisoned beer under stars they'd never see set. The sedatives worked faster than expected, or maybe the heat and alcohol accelerated their effect. By 10:20, Big Eddie had gone quiet in the water, his movement sluggish. Slim Morrison tried to climb out at the deep end ladder, but missed his grip, sliding back in. Coach complained that his legs felt heavy. "Must be that cheap beer." Vernon laughed from his chair, not noticing, not caring. Carmen walked over to him, all smiles. "Vernon, honey, I think we left some ice in the office freezer. Would you mind grabbing it? We're running low." The night clerk hauled himself up, swaying slightly from his own beers. "Sure thing, darlin'. Be right back." As soon as he rounded the corner toward the office, Luis and Tomas moved. The pool ladders came out first, both the deep end ladder and the corner handrails unbolted with a socket wrench in under 30 seconds. The metal scraped against tile, a sound that should have alarmed the swimmers, but most were too disoriented to notice. Maria walked to the shallow end steps and began removing the handrail there too, working quickly, her hand steady despite the hammer of her heart. "Hey," Ray Thornton said, treading water near the edge, his words slurred. "Hey, what are you doing?" Carmen turned up the radio. Bad Moon Rising drowned out his question. By the time Vernon returned with the bag of ice, the pool gate was locked from the outside, and Luis was pocketing the key. Through the chain-link fence, Vernon could see the party still going. Music playing, the sisters moving around the deck. Everything looked normal. Inside the fence, 9 men were beginning to realize something was very wrong. The water had become a prison with no way out. The first scream came at 10:37 p.m., when Slim Morrison finally understood that the ladder wasn't just moved, it was gone. His fingers scraped uselessly against smooth tile, searching for metal that no longer existed. This was the moment 9 men learned what Rosa must have felt. Helpless, trapped, with no one coming to save them. Big Eddie was the first to try reasoning with the sisters. He paddled to the pool's edge where Maria stood, his movements clumsy, his usual swagger dissolved in chlorinated water and creeping sedation. "Look, girls, this ain't funny. Put the ladder back." Maria crouched down, close enough that he could see her face in the underwater light's glow. She pulled Rosa's photograph from her pocket, held it inches from his eyes. "You remember her? Rosa Vega, 16 years old. You told her you'd get her work in Houston." Eddie's face went slack with something beyond the drugs. Recognition, maybe guilt, maybe just fear. "Where is she?" Maria's voice was ice over steel. I don't know what you're..." Carmen appeared beside her sister, holding a pool skimmer like a spear. Wrong answer. When Eddie grabbed for the pool's edge to haul himself out, Carmen jabbed the skimmer into his chest, pushing him back into the water. Not hard enough to injure, just hard enough to send a message. "You're not getting out." The other men had caught on now. The construction worker, his name was Pete. Maria had learned Pete Dominguez tried to boost himself out using upper body strength, but his arms shook with the effort, the sedatives making his muscles unreliable. Ray Thornton swam to the shallow end, thinking he could simply walk out via the steps, only to find Carmen blocking his path with a long-handled pool brush. "Please," Ray said, and the desperation in his voice was almost funny coming from a man who'd spent years taking what he wanted. "Please, I got a wife. I got kids." Rosa had family too, Carmen said. She didn't move. Coach tried a different approach, the white-haired man who'd coached Little League, who'd smiled at parents while their daughters learned to fear his private training sessions. He trod water near the wall, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of authority. "Now, ladies, I don't know what you think happened, but this is assault. You let us out right now, we can forget this whole thing." Maria laughed, sharp and humorless. "You're going to call the police? Tell them what? That you were at a sleazy motel pool party and got stuck in the water?" Through it all, Vernon remained outside the locked gate, finally understanding that something had gone terribly wrong, but unsure how to process it. Luis stepped from the shadows near the fence, and Vernon took an instinctive step back. "You don't want to be here," Luis said quietly. "You don't want to see this. You don't want to remember this. Those men are exactly where they need to be." Luis pulled a roll of bills from his pocket. $200, more than Vernon made in a week. "You're going to go back to your office. You're going to put on some music, loud. You're going to have a few more beers, and around midnight, you're going to take a walk to check the pool, and you're going to find something real unfortunate. But right now, you were never here." Vernon looked at the money, looked at the pool where 9 men thrashed and shouted, looked at Luis's face, which held no mercy and no negotiation. He took the money and walked away. Humans are capable of terrible things when they decide someone else's suffering doesn't concern them. By 11 p.m., the sedatives had reached their full effect. Big Eddie could barely keep his head above water, his massive body working against him. The bald man, Jerry something, a trucker from Dallas, had vomited into the pool, the effort leaving him gasping. Raul, the youngest and strongest, had tried 3 times to climb the wall where the ladder had been, his fingers finding no purchase on the slick tile. The Vega siblings watched with expressions carved from stone. Tomas stood guard at the gate with the pool shock pole, a long fiberglass rod normally used to fish out leaves and debris. When Pete Dominguez got close to the edge near the deep end, Tomas extended the pole and pushed him back toward the center, gently at first, then harder when Pete tried to grab it. "Tell us about Rosa," Maria called across the water. "Who saw her last? Where did she go?" The men's stories tumbled out in fragments between gasps for air. Eddie had given her a ride, yeah, but he'd dropped her at a bar in Houston, he swore it. Slim had seen her at the motel, but never touched her, never even talked to her. Coach didn't know any Rosa, didn't know what they were talking about. Lies, all of it, or half-truths wrapped in self-preservation. Raul, treading water in the center of the pool, finally broke. Okay. Jesus Christ, she was here. She was here for like 3 weeks. Eddie brought her, said she needed a place to stay. Some of the guys paid her for company, you know? But she got scared, wanted to leave. Eddie said no. She owed him for the ride, for the room. They had a fight. She tried to run, and what? Carmen's voice cut through the night like a blade. "I don't know. I swear, I don't know." Eddie and Slim took her somewhere to cool off, and she never came back. I thought they just drove her to the bus station, made her go home. Maria looked at Eddie, who'd gone silent in the shallow end, his head barely above water now. "Eddie?" The big man said nothing. His eyes were glazed, his breathing labored. "Where is my cousin Eddie?" Still nothing. Maybe he was too far gone to answer. Maybe he was choosing silence. Maybe he genuinely didn't care. It didn't matter anymore. The night stretched like taffy, hot and sticky. By 11:40, 3 of the men had lost consciousness, their faces slipping below the surface before panic brought them sputtering back up. The others clung to the pool walls, their arms burning, their legs cramping, their voices hoarse from shouting for help that never came. The motel rooms around the pool stayed dark. Other guests heard the commotion. They'd later admit as much, but nobody looked out their windows. Nobody called the police. Nobody wanted to be involved in whatever was happening at the Starlight Motor Court at midnight on a Saturday. The jukebox in the motel office played "The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down" on repeat, Vernon's contribution to not hearing what he didn't want to hear. Carmen walked the perimeter of the pool, watching the men struggle. She felt nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse, just a cold, empty certainty that this was justice in its rawest form. When Coach tried one final time to reason with her, his white hair plastered to his skull, his voice shaking, she finally responded, "My cousin was 16. How old were the girls you coached?" Coach's face told her everything she needed to know. She turned the radio up louder and walked away. Some deaths are slower than others. By 12:17 a.m., the pool had gone quiet, except for the filter pump's mechanical wheeze and the slap of small waves against tile. Under the buzzing lights, 9 shapes floated in formations that looked almost peaceful from a distance. The human body can fight for survival for only so long before the water wins. Big Eddie had been the third to go under for the last time, his bulk betraying him as the sedatives and exhaustion combined into something final. He'd stopped thrashing around 11:55, his movements becoming languid, dreamlike, before his face simply slipped beneath the surface and stayed there. Slim Morrison had lasted longer, his swimmer's build buying him extra minutes, but the drugs made his limbs useless anchors. He'd called for his mother at the end, a sound that should have broken something in the sisters watching from the deck. It didn't. Coach had been the last conscious man in the water, his decades of conditioning keeping him alert even as his body failed. He'd stared at Maria with eyes that held animal terror and human understanding. He knew why. He knew this was payment for sins he'd convinced himself weren't really sins at all. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered, barely audible. Not to the sisters, to someone else. to everyone else. Then he went under. Maria checked her watch, 12:18 a.m., Sunday, August 20th, 1972. She looked at Carmen, at Luis, at Tomas, her family, her co-conspirators, her jury, and executioners. "We should go," Luis said quietly. The initial adrenaline had worn off, leaving something heavier in its place. Not regret exactly, but the weight of understanding that they'd crossed into territory from which there was no return. Carmen gathered the cups and bottles with mechanical precision, wiping down surfaces, removing evidence of the party that had never really been a party. The marked beer bottles went into a garbage bag. The coolers would be cleaned and donated to Goodwill in a different city. The radio would be wiped down and returned to the friend they'd borrowed it from, along with a story about a quiet night in their room. Tomas reattached the pool ladders. The detail was crucial. When Vernon discovered the bodies, everything needed to look like a tragic accident. 9 men, drunk and careless, deciding to swim, despite the sedatives they'd somehow ingested. Maybe contaminated alcohol. Maybe someone had spiked the cooler as a prank. Maybe they'd taken pills earlier in the evening. The police would investigate, but they'd be looking for external causes, not inside jobs. The gate lock clicked open. The siblings slipped out into the parking lot where their pickup truck waited. They drove away from the Starlight Motor Court at 12:34 a.m., taking the service road instead of the highway, their headlights cutting through the thick Texas night. Behind them, the pool lights continued to buzz and glow, illuminating what had become a aquatic tomb. Vernon emerged from his office at 12:45 a.m., exactly as instructed. He'd finished the beer Luis had left him, turned the jukebox down to a reasonable volume, and taken his time walking to the pool area. He had to sell this. He had to be the shocked employee who discovered something terrible. From the San Antonio Police Department Incident Report, filed August 20th, 1972 at 1:37 a.m. Night clerk Vernon Staples called in multiple drowning victims at the Starlight Motor Court pool. Stated he closed his office around 12:30 a.m. for his rounds and discovered 9 male subjects floating in the pool, unresponsive. Victims appeared to have been swimming, drinking. No signs of struggle. Pool area gate was unlocked. Ladders in place. Cause of death pending autopsy. The first patrol car arrived at 1:04 a.m. Officers Ramirez and Chen responding to what dispatch had described as a possible prank call. Nobody drowned 9 people at once. It didn't make sense. Then they saw the pool. Chen had been on the force for 12 years, had worked traffic fatalities and domestic murders, but he'd never seen anything like this. The bodies drifted in lazy circles, the pool's circulation system pushing them in a grotesque waltz. Some floated face down, arms spread. Others had sunk to the bottom, visible through 6 feet of chlorinated water that magnified their stillness. "Jesus Christ," Ramirez whispered. He was 24, fresh from the academy. This would be the call that haunted him for decades. Vernon sat on a plastic chair, his face buried in his hands, playing the traumatized witness perfectly. I came out to check things, and they were, all of them. I thought maybe someone was playing a joke, but more units arrived. The medical examiner, Detective Morrison, the same one who dismissed Rosa's disappearance 2 months earlier. Crime scene photographers who would capture images that never made it into newspapers because editors deemed them too disturbing. The Starlight's other guests began emerging from their rooms, drawn by the flashing lights. They stood in robes and rumpled clothes, staring at the chaos, claiming they'd heard nothing unusual. Just some music earlier, maybe some shouting, but that was normal for the Starlight on a Saturday night. A community of witnesses who'd witnessed nothing. Detective Morrison surveyed the scene with the grim efficiency of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize horror. 9 men, 9 separate drownings in the same pool at the same time. The statistical impossibility made his head hurt. "Anyone see what happened?" he asked Vernon. The night clerk shook his head. I was in the office most of the night. There was a pool party earlier, couple of girls having some people over. Nothing unusual. I checked on them around 9:30. Everything seemed fine. Told them to keep it down after 10. When I came out at 12:45 to do my rounds. These girls, they still here? Vernon consulted his guest register, a performance he'd rehearsed in his head a dozen times. Room 114. Lopez. Maria and Carmen. They checked in 2 weeks ago, I think. Officers were dispatched to room 114. They knocked. No answer. They used the master key and found the room empty, cleaned out, 2 rumpled beds, and bathroom towels hung neatly on racks. The Lopez sisters had checked out between midnight and 1 a.m., leaving their key on the dresser. Nobody had seen them leave. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Huang, began the grim work of cataloging bodies. She noticed the same details in each victim. Dilated pupils, foam around the mouth, the cherry red skin that suggested oxygen deprivation. But something else, too. A chemical smell beneath the chlorine. She pulled Detective Morrison aside. These men didn't just drown, they were compromised before they hit the water. I'm seeing signs of central nervous system depression, sedation, most likely. I won't know what until we run a full tox screen, but they weren't just drunk. Someone drugged them. Morrison's mind raced. 9 drugged men. A pool party. 2 women who'd vanished. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. The Starlight Motor Court became a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoning off the pool area while investigators searched for evidence. They found beer bottles in the trash, dusted them for prints. They found cigarette butts, paper cups, a radio with the battery removed. They interviewed every guest, every employee, everyone who'd been within 100 yards of the pool that night. The stories were remarkably consistent. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything unusual. Nobody remembered 2 Mexican girls, except that they kept to themselves. Vernon's statement was taken 3 separate times. His story never changed. There'd been a party. He'd checked on it once. Everything seemed fine. He'd been in his office from 10 p.m. to 12:30 a.m., listening to his jukebox, doing paperwork. When he'd gone to check the pool, he'd found the bodies. These Lopez sisters, Morrison pressed. What'd they look like? Vernon shrugged. Mexican girls, late teens, early 20s. Pretty. Dark hair. One was taller than the other. They paid cash, kept to themselves. Seemed nice enough. You get ID from them? Course I did. Texas driver's licenses. Checked out fine. Except when Morrison ran the names and license numbers Vernon had copied, they came back to an elderly woman in Amarillo and a man doing 10 years in Huntsville for armed robbery. The IDs had been fake. Professional grade. Good enough to fool a lazy motel clerk who cared more about cash than accuracy. The Lopez sisters didn't exist. Which meant somewhere in San Antonio, 2 women had just committed the most elaborate mass murder in Texas history and walked away clean. The investigation was about to get much more complicated. Dr. Patricia Huang's morgue smelled like formaldehyde and industrial cleaner, the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the August heat that turned the basement facility into a humid crypt. Steel tables reflected fluorescent lights in harsh white lines. 9 bodies meant 9 autopsies, and each one told the same chemical story. The toxicology reports came back on August 23rd, 3 days after the drownings. Every victim showed elevated levels of acepromazine in their blood, a veterinary sedative powerful enough to drop a 1,200-pound bull. The dosages varied slightly between victims, suggesting someone had calculated amounts based on body weight. Big Eddie, at 280 pounds, had received nearly double what Slim Morrison got. Pete Dominguez, the construction worker, had ingested enough to make his limbs useless but not enough to render him unconscious. Whoever administered the drugs understood pharmacology. Detective Morrison spread the toxicology reports across his desk, coffee going cold in a styrofoam cup, while his mind connected dots he didn't want to see. 9 men drugged and drowned. 2 women who didn't exist. a motel clerk who'd been conveniently deaf and blind. And underneath it all, a pattern he'd missed 2 months earlier. He pulled the Rosa Vega missing persons file from the bottom drawer where he'd buried it. The cousin who'd filed the report had been named Maria Vega, the same first name as one of the Lopez sisters who'd vanished from the Starlight. The report included a phone number for the family in Corpus Christi. Morrison dialed it at 2:15 p.m., and a woman answered on the third ring. "Mrs. Vega? This is Detective Frank Morrison with San Antonio PD. I'm calling about your daughter Rosa's missing persons case." The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats too long. "I have 2 daughters," the woman finally said, her English accented but clear. "Maria and Carmen. Rosa was my niece. Have you found her?" Morrison's stomach dropped. "Mrs. Vega, where are your daughters right now?" "Working. Maria at the grocery store. Carmen at the salon." "Why? What's this about?" He thanked her and hung up, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the department directory. The Corpus Christi PD confirmed it within an hour. Maria Vega, age 19, had been working her shift at Handy Andy Supermarket all weekend. Carmen Vega, age 17, had cut hair at Rosa's beauty salon on Saturday from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Multiple witnesses, time cards. No way either sister could have been in San Antonio, except Morrison knew with absolute certainty that they had been. The alibis were too perfect, which made them perfect lies. The sisters had accomplices, family members willing to clock in for them, co-workers willing to swear they'd been there. The Mexican community in Corpus Christi had closed ranks, protecting 2 girls who'd done what the police wouldn't. Find justice for Rosa. Morrison drove to Corpus Christi on August 25th, taking Highway 37 through scrubland that shimmered in the heat. The Vega family lived in a small house near the port, paint peeling, chain-link fence separating their yard from the neighbors. Maria answered the door, wiping flour from her hands, looking every bit the innocent grocery clerk. "Detective Morrison," she said, no surprise in her voice. "Would you like some coffee?" They sat at the kitchen table while Maria's mother and younger siblings occupied the living room, a united front of blank faces. Morrison laid out photos of the 9 victims, watching Maria's expression for any flicker of recognition. "Nothing." "Do you know any of these men?" he asked. Maria studied each photo with the careful attention of someone examining strangers. "No. Should I? They all drowned at the Starlight Motor Court on August 19th. Same place your cousin Rosa was last seen. I remember you telling me Rosa probably ran off with some boy." Maria's voice held no accusation, just statement of fact, that she'd turn up eventually. Morrison felt the barb land. "I'm reopening her case. I think what happened to these men might be connected to what happened to Rosa." "You think 9 grown men drowning themselves has something to do with a 16-year-old runaway?" Maria tilted her head, genuinely puzzled. "Or perfectly performing puzzlement. That seems like a stretch, Detective." He switched tactics. "Where were you on Saturday, August 19th? "Working. 9 to 6 at Handy Andy. You can check my time card." "I already did. You clocked in at 9:02 a.m., clocked out at 6:04 p.m. Didn't miss a single punch." Maria smiled. "Then I guess I was working." Carmen appeared in the doorway, home from the salon, still wearing her pink work smock. She looked younger than 17, all wide eyes and careful innocence. "Is everything okay, Maria? The detective is asking about some men who drowned in San Antonio. I told him we don't know anything about it." Morrison showed Carmen the same photos, same blank stares, same polite denials. He tried one last card. "Ace Promazine. That's a veterinary sedative. You know anyone who works with animals? Has access to that kind of drug?" The sisters exchanged glances. Carmen answered, "Our brother Luis worked at a vet clinic for a while, but he quit months ago, got a job at the port instead." Luis Vega's employment records confirmed it. He'd resigned from Coastal Veterinary Services on June 30th, citing better pay elsewhere. His former supervisor remembered him as reliable, quiet, never caused problems. When Morrison asked about missing drugs, the supervisor checked inventory logs and found nothing suspicious. Every avenue led to a dead end, paved with airtight alibis. Back in San Antonio, Morrison's captain was losing patience. "You're chasing Mexican girls who were provably in Corpus Christi while 9 scumbags drowned themselves. The tox reports show they were drugged." Yeah, but by who? The imaginary Lopez sisters? A motel clerk who passed a polygraph? Let it go, Frank. But Morrison couldn't let it go, because the 9 victims' backgrounds had started emerging, and they painted a picture uglier than the drownings themselves. Big Eddie Thornton had been questioned in Oklahoma about 2 missing teenage girls in 1969. Never charged. Ray Thornton, same last name, younger brother, had restraining orders from 3 ex-girlfriends, 2 of whom were minors when they dated him. Coach Westfield had been quietly dismissed from his Little League position after parents complained about inappropriate touching. The investigation had been handled internally. Slim Morrison, no relation to the detective, had been arrested twice for solicitation of minors, but pleaded down both times. Every single victim had a history, some documented, most whispered about, all ignored by a justice system that prioritized reputation over protection. The Starlight Motor Court's guest records going back 5 years revealed a pattern. Young women checking in alone, staying a few weeks, then disappearing. The motel had been a hunting ground, and 9 men had been its most frequent hunters. Rosa Vega's name never appeared in any official record, but a waitress at the truck stop finally came forward on August 30th. Guilt overriding fear. She'd seen Rosa get into Big Eddie's truck in mid-June, saw her crying, saw Eddie laugh, and drive away. When the waitress asked Vernon about it later, he'd shrugged. "Girls come and go. Not our problem." Nobody had filed a report. Nobody had asked questions. Nobody had cared until 9 bodies forced them to care. Morrison sat in his office at midnight on September 2nd, surrounded by files on victims who weren't really victims and suspects he couldn't prove existed. The captain wanted him to close the case as accidental drowning, tragic, mysterious, but ultimately just 9 drunk idiots who'd gotten themselves killed. But Morrison knew better. Somewhere in Texas, 2 teenage girls had committed the perfect crime, and the only evidence was a missing cousin who'd probably been murdered by the men who drowned in a pool while those girls watched. Rough justice in a world where the law had failed. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote a single sentence in his case notes. Rosa Vega, continue investigation. Then he closed the file on the Starlight drownings and marked it. Accidental death, die 9. No suspects. Case closed. Some truths are better left in the water. The San Antonio Express printed exactly 47 words about the Starlight drownings on page 11, between an advertisement for Chevrolets and a church bake sale announcement. 9 men. Accidental death. Investigation closed. Some stories get buried not because they're forgotten, but because remembering them asks too many uncomfortable questions. The Starlight Motor Court closed for renovations on September 15th, 1972. The pool was drained, bleached, and refilled, but the new water never looked quite right. Too blue, too chemical, like it was trying too hard to forget. The motel reopened 6 weeks later under new management, who immediately installed security cameras and bright floodlights. Business dropped by 60%. Truckers took their cash to motels up the highway where the pools didn't have stories attached. Vernon Staples kept working the night desk until November, when he stopped showing up for shifts. The owner found him 3 days later in his apartment, dead from what the coroner ruled alcohol poisoning. His blood alcohol content was .38. The bottle of whiskey beside his bed was empty. No note, no explanation. Just another casualty of that August night, delayed by guilt and grief. In Corpus Christi, the Vega family maintained their routines with the discipline of people who understood that normalcy was their best defense. Maria continued working at Handy Andy, always pleasant, always punctual. Carmen cut hair and gossiped with clients about weddings and quinceañeras. Luis worked the port, loading cargo ships bound for places that didn't ask questions. Tomas drove a delivery truck, his routes taking him through small Texas towns where faces blurred together. They never spoke about San Antonio. Not to each other, not to their mother, not even in the privacy of their own thoughts if they could help it. But sometimes, late at night, Maria would wake from dreams of floating bodies and find Carmen already awake in the bed next to hers, staring at the ceiling. "You okay?" Maria would whisper. "Yeah," Carmen would lie, and they'd both go back to pretending sleep would come. The underground network that had helped them, the forgers who'd made fake IDs, the coworkers who'd covered shifts, the family friends who'd vouched for alibis, never asked for payment or explanation. The Mexican community in South Texas understood codes that didn't require speaking. Family protects family. And sometimes, protection meant looking away, while justice found its own path. Rosa's photograph stayed pinned to the Vega kitchen wall, surrounded by prayer candles that Maria's mother kept burning. No body was ever found. No funeral was ever held. But everyone who entered that house understood that Rosa had been avenged, even if they didn't know the details. Some prayers are answered with fire and water. Detective Morrison continued investigating Rosa's disappearance through September and into October, driving roads between San Antonio and Houston, checking every ditch and field where a body might be hidden. He interviewed truckers at rest stops, showed Rosa's picture to waitresses and gas station attendants, followed leads that went nowhere. On October 28th, he got a call from a rancher outside of Seguin. They'd been clearing brush for a new fence line and found remains female, approximately 16 to 18 years old, buried shallow beneath a mesquite tree. Dental records confirmed what Morrison had suspected for months. Rosa Elena Vega had been dead since late June, approximately 2 weeks after her last postcard home. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. The medical examiner estimated she'd been buried within hours of death, probably killed at or near the burial site. Morrison sat in his car outside the Vega house for 20 minutes before knocking on the door. Maria's mother answered, took one look at his face, and simply nodded. She'd known. They'd all known. Hope was the lie they'd told themselves to keep breathing. Where was all she asked. Morrison gave her the details, watched her age 10 years in 10 seconds, and said the thing he'd rehearsed in his head during the drive from Seguin. "Mrs. Vega, I want you to know. I believe your daughter Maria was in San Antonio on August 19th. I believe she and Carmen did something terrible and necessary, and I want you to know that I'm not going to pursue it. There's no case I can make, and even if there was, I wouldn't make it." Maria's mother studied his face with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be surprised by kindness. "My Rosa was a good girl, trusted everyone. That's what killed her, Detective. Her belief that the world was better than it is. I'm sorry I didn't. You're sorry you didn't look harder when it mattered. I know. But being sorry doesn't bring her back." She paused, then added quietly, "Those men at the motel, did they suffer?" Morrison thought about the autopsy reports, the claw marks on the pool tiles, the water in the lungs. "Yes, ma'am. I believe they did." She nodded again and closed the door. Rosa's funeral was held on November 4th at Our Lady of Guadalupe in Corpus Christi. 83 people attended, filling the small church with prayers in Spanish and English, hymns that spoke of souls returning home. Maria and Carmen sat in the front pew with their family, dry-eyed and still, bearing witness to the end they'd already written. Nobody mentioned the starlight. Nobody whispered about vengeance. But everyone understood that Rosa's death had been answered in a language older than law. The story spread through underground channels, beauty salons and church basements, backyard barbecues, and late-night kitchen conversations. The details changed with each telling. Sometimes it was 2 sisters, sometimes 4, sometimes a whole family. Sometimes the men numbered 9, sometimes 12, sometimes 20. But the core remained constant. Young women had drowned men who preyed on girls like them and walked away free. The legend made its way to other communities where similar stories existed. Daughters disappeared, police shrugged, families grieved alone. In some places, the Vega sisters became folk heroes. In others, cautionary tales. But always, they represented something dangerous and necessary. The idea that justice could be seized when the system refused to grant it. What would you risk to avenge someone you loved? By Christmas 1972, the Starlight drownings had been forgotten by everyone except those who needed to remember. The motel's new owners repainted the pool deck and changed the name to the Lone Star Motor Lodge. Vernon's replacement was a 60-year-old woman who kept a baseball bat behind the desk and called the police at the first sign of trouble. The Vega sisters continued their lives, carrying secrets that grew heavier with each year, but never quite heavy enough to put down. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, become people their younger selves wouldn't recognize. But Rosa's photograph stayed on the kitchen wall, proof that some loves demanded blood for blood, water for water, drowning for drowning. And in the deep end of that San Antonio pool, where the light never quite reached the bottom, something darker than shadows continued to pool. 23 years after the drownings, a Texaco station opened on the east side of San Antonio, painted bright red and white, the pumps modern and gleaming. Above the cash register hung a photograph of a teenage girl with braids, smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. The Vega sisters had finally come home to the scene of their crime, and nobody recognized them. Maria Vega, now Maria Ortiz, after a quiet marriage to a mechanic named Roberto, managed the station with the same precision she'd once used to measure poison into beer bottles. Carmen, who'd taken her husband's surname of Delgado, handled the books and inventory. Together they'd saved for years, pooling wages from grocery stores and salons and port work, until they had enough to buy a failing gas station 3 miles from the Starlight Motor Court. The location was deliberate. Everything about the Vega sisters was deliberate. By 1995, the Starlight had been demolished, replaced by a strip mall housing a Dollar General and a tax preparation service. The pool where 9 men drowned existed only in courthouse records and fading memories. But the Vegas remembered. Every day they drove past that empty lot, they remembered. Rosa's photograph stayed above the register, professionally framed, with a small brass plaque underneath. Rosa Elena Vega, 1956 to 1972. Beloved daughter, cousin, friend, forever in our hearts. Customers sometimes asked about the picture. Maria's answer never varied. My cousin. She died young. We keep her memory alive. Nobody asked how she died. People in San Antonio had learned not to ask too many questions about the past. The gas station became a fixture in the neighborhood, reliable, fair-priced, known for Maria's homemade tamales at Christmas and Carmen's willingness to let struggling families pay for gas next week. The Vegas embedded themselves in the community, attending church, sponsoring Little League teams, doing all the visible good works that respectable citizens performed. But late at night, when the last customer had driven away and the sisters locked up, they'd stand beneath Rosa's photograph and remember a humid August evening when they'd become something other than victims. From a journal entry found among Maria's effects, dated August 19, 1997, the 25th anniversary. I don't regret it. I should, maybe. 9 lives for one. But I think about all the Rosas they won't hurt now, all the girls who'll make it home because those men can't hunt anymore. Sometimes justice is quieter than law. Sometimes it's louder. Ours was wet and final, and I'd do it again. Luis Vega died in 2003 from heart failure, taking his veterinary secrets to a grave marked with a simple stone. Tomas lasted until 2009, a stroke taking him quickly at his kitchen table. Neither brother ever spoke publicly about that night, but their children grew up knowing that family meant protection, even when protection required darkness. The Starlight drownings remained officially closed, filed in boxes that had been moved to 3 different storage facilities over the decades. The case file was thin toxicology reports, witness statements that said nothing. photographs of 9 bodies that nobody wanted to look at twice. Detective Frank Morrison had retired in 1983. His final notation on Rosa's case reading simply, "Victim found, suspects unknown, justice served through other means." He'd understood, in the end, what the law couldn't accommodate. The internet changed everything and nothing. True crime forums discovered the Starlight case in the early 2000s, spinning theories about serial killers and gang hits and elaborate conspiracies. Nobody connected it to Rosa Vega's murder 6 weeks earlier. Nobody connected the Lopez sisters to the Vega family. The dots existed, but the line between them had been erased by time and complicity. A blogger in 2012 came closest to the truth, posting a long analysis titled, "The Starlight Drownings, Mass Murder or Vigilante Justice." The post included Rosa's missing persons report, the victim profiles, the suspicious timing, but without proof, without witnesses, without any official acknowledgement. The theory remained speculation. Maria read the blog post on the station's computer, Carmen looking over her shoulder, both sisters silent. Then Maria deleted the browser history and went back to counting receipts. Some stories work better as whispers than evidence. Carmen died first, in 2016. Cancer taking her with the same quiet inevitability that had taken so much else. Her funeral drew 200 people, testimony to a life lived in service and silence. Maria stood at the graveside, thinking about 2 teenage girls who'd checked into a motel under false names and emerged as something evolution hadn't planned for. Predators who hunted predators. Maria ran the station alone for another 3 years, growing frailer but no less watchful. Regular customers noticed she'd started talking to Rosa's photograph, one-sided conversations about weather and family news, as if the gap between living and dead had narrowed with age. On August 19th, 1947 years, exactly after the drownings, Maria closed the station early. She drove to the lot where the Starlight had stood, parked, and sat in her car for 2 hours, staring at nothing. A security guard from the Dollar General eventually checked on her. "You okay, ma'am?" "Just remembering," Maria said. "Just remembering something that happened here a long time ago. Must have been something special. It was something necessary." She died that October, peacefully in her sleep, according to the death certificate, though her granddaughter found an empty bottle of pills on the nightstand and chose not to mention it to the coroner. Some exits are chosen, not granted. The gas station was sold to a national chain, rebranded and renovated. Rosa's photograph came down, replaced by promotional posters for energy drinks and lottery tickets. The new owners knew nothing about the women who'd built the business, and the neighborhood slowly forgot. But every August, on the anniversary of the drownings, someone leaves flowers at the empty lot where the Starlight once stood. Yellow roses, Rosa's favorite, tied with a purple ribbon. No card, no name, just flowers that appear at dawn and wilt under the Texas sun. The San Antonio Police Department received an anonymous tip in 2022, 50 years after the murders, claiming to have evidence about the Starlight case. The tip led detectives to a storage unit in Corpus Christi, rented under Maria Vega's maiden name. Inside, they found a spiral notebook filled with observations, dates, and plans. A small bottle labeled acepromazine with a veterinary clinic's faded label, and a stack of photographs showing the Starlight Motor Court from every angle, including detailed images of the pool's ladder mechanism. The detective who opened the unit, a woman named Rodriguez who'd read about the case in training, stood in that small concrete room and understood she was looking at a confession from beyond the grave, evidence that could finally close the case officially. She reported finding nothing but old tax documents and moth-eaten clothes. Some justice doesn't require courtrooms. The story of the Vega sisters exists now in the spaces between documentation and legend. Mothers tell it to daughters as a warning about what happens when you trust the wrong people. Fathers tell it to sons as a reminder that predators sometimes become prey. Activists cite it as proof that the system fails victims who have to become their own justice. And in San Antonio, on certain humid August nights when the air feels too thick to breathe, people swear they can hear splashing from pools that no longer exist, and the sound of men calling for help that never comes. The Starlight Motor Court is gone, but its ghost lingers in every motel pool along Interstate 10, in every roadside stop where the vulnerable learn to be vigilant. 9 men drowned because they'd forgotten that even the powerless have power when pushed far enough. Rosa Vega never lived to see justice, but her cousins made sure justice saw her. Some say Maria Vega's granddaughter still makes the drive from Corpus Christi every August 19th, still leaves those yellow roses at dawn before anyone else wakes, still keeps a photograph of Rosa in her wallet, not as a victim, but as a reminder of what love demands when the world turns away. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.